Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Baiguan Radio. With me today is Joan. This is our second episode with Joan, a macro hedge fund manager from Brazil. Last time, Joan and we chatted about the future trajectory of RMB. But this time, by the end of last episode, I asked Joan to come back again to talk about something I think is even more relevant to his career, which is about Brazil and Latin America and the relationship between Latin America and China, a topic that has been gaining more and more attention and a relationship that is becoming stronger.
Hi, Robert. Thank you very much for your invitation. It's a pleasure to talk about these subjects that are so interesting these days.
Definitely. So I will start with a simple question. I always wonder, there's once I've been in Latin America. I think that was 15 years ago. I was traveling as part of my graduation trip to Brazil, of all places, and it was a very long trip. We traveled from some of us travel from the US. I travel from China. It was a really long, tough flight. Actually, two flights. It's always at least 30 hours, right? It's the longest flight I ever had in my life. So it was always very distant. And that's my last time. And so I always wonder how really do people on the ground in Brazil, in Latin America, how China is really perceived today. We always watch the news. We have some social media mentioning here and there, but I always wonder what's really the reality on the ground right now.
Yeah, I think, and I every time I go to China, people, they comment like, wow, it's such a long flight. But I think that in especially South America, we are used to long flights because like Australia, we're a little bit far from everything. I think the first point to help our listeners is to point the distinction. When you say Latin America, it's such a large group of countries. It's like saying, let's say, Asia. I think the bulk of what we're going to discuss in the end is going to be South America. Central America is quite different. Brazil and Mexico, we have a lot of similarities, but there's not so much cultural exchange between the two countries, for example. And these are the two largest in the region. So like Central and America is much more connected to the US, for example. It's very close. While South America is a world in itself. It's quite far. Just to give you an example, if you take Miami to the rest of the region, Miami to the Caribbean is like Guangzhou to South China Sea. It's quite close, right? But if you take Miami to, say, South America, like Brazil, it's like Guangzhou to India or Iran. It's far, right? We do have a lot of similarities. Culturally, there's a lot of affinity between Brazil and the US, for example, a lot. And the time zone is the same, it helps. So it's much closer than comparing south of China to South Asia. But you get the point in terms of geography. You asking about the perception of China in the region. China is so far away that people have mostly the experiences they had on TV and from immigration, right? So in Brazil, for example, we have a very large Japanese community from a very long time. And the Japanese community has a very positive image in Brazil. So I think the Chinese benefit from that, and so did the Koreans. But beyond that, I think the image that China had in Brazil was similar to Japan and Korea through products, right? So my parents always used to say that the Japanese products were the cheap ones, and then Korea had a little bit of that. So this was the business card, let's say. So China followed these steps, right? But even faster, I would say, right? I think that the year that really changed everything was last year. I think this is something we spoke about on the previous episode. And why did it happen? Because this is the year that people realize that China is a reality. It's not a problem that's going to go away. So even in the US, right, the perception before was that we have a problem with China, we have to deal with it. If we press this button, we can solve the problem. And then they realized that China is just a reality. You have to deal with it instead of hoping that the problem will go away. And I think this happened to the whole region, like the fact that China stood quite strongly in the trade war, the technological developments in AI, semiconductors, soft power. We spoke about Labubu last time, right? So I think all of these things put China in a different image, in a different place in the region. I can even see from social media, so many Brazilians and South Americans are traveling to China now. And it's interesting that when I go, I have friends from all sorts of political sides commenting on positively. If you are extreme this side or extreme that other side, it doesn't matter. People are interested. People are trying to see China with a different eyes, I think. So I think this is the image that China has now.
Perfect. Do you think there's a difference in terms of how the political leaders, business elites see China and the general public? I think you mostly talk about the general public just now, but how do you see like political leadership view China differently?
Yeah, I think politically it's quite deep, and with all the interactions that you would expect, business, politics, diplomacy, all of that. So I think this is quite deep in the whole region, I would say. In terms of business, it's very pragmatic, but it's still, they don't have a lot of understanding, I think. I lived in China for a while, in Singapore later, and I'm surprised how little experience in Asia, especially China, people have. You have a lot of people in trading, but these are not the big businesses. These are like a more import-export kind of medium-sized businesses. So that's it. In public, as I mentioned. So I think the interesting in public is that I think that the biggest change that China had in image was because of BYD. I think BYD was the biggest ambassador China had here.
Wow.
Because I remember a couple of years ago, people know that I deal with China, and they used to tell me, João, I understand that China has good technology, but I will never put my family in a Chinese car. And then now I go to my kids' school, and there's like a BYD, 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 like one after the other.
Oh.
So I think that once people go into a nice car like BYD, they realize that it's not only a good car, but that the technology is superior to the European and American peers, right? So I think that BYD is one of the best ambassadors that China could have. One thing it's interesting is that in Latin America, in Brazil special, the trend has been a bit different from, let's say, the G7 countries, the Europe and the US. So the way I see it is, for these richer countries, China was first a supplier, then China became a client, and then now China is a competitor. So it's a very difficult change when you go from a client to competitor. In the region, we are more complementary in terms of trade. We export commodities. We need the Chinese technology. For example, DeepSeek or Kimi, it's mostly free, right? It's different from US AI. And we sell a lot to China, right? You have the infrastructure investments and all of that. So this is different from the dynamic you see in the richer countries. So if people come from the US, especially to Brazil, and they're surprised, like how many Chinese cars we have, how people in the public office, they don't really worry about having a Huawei supplier, because for us it's obvious, like it's much cheaper, and we cannot afford to have this kind of worries. So I think this has changed. Another interesting thing is, if you are in Brazil and you import, let's say, a Volkswagen or a BMW, if you stop buying a BMW and you to buy let's say a BYD, there's depending on the industry, you're not losing jobs in Brazil. You are losing jobs in Europe. So for the Brazilian people and the government, it doesn't really matter if you're buying from China or from the US or Europe, because it's not being produced in our country anyway. Again, this is a big difference from the other countries. From the Chinese point of view, I can see also a difference, again, not from our side, from the Chinese side. In the past 2-3 years, I used to joke that when China is so competitive that it sells a lot. So I used to joke when I went to China, say, my is to do business is buy and sell, right? So if you just sell and you don't buy, it's not doing business, it's just selling. So I think China has realized that. You have to be mindful of the other markets you go into. And you can see that already in Southeast Asia, but China is being more mindful of its size and its disruptions. And I think this is happening, it will and will continue to happening in Latin America as well. And I think one of the ways they are doing it is that they're coordinating more with the private sector. Because while 10 years ago, the biggest flow of investments in the region was, let's say, state-led investments in big ticket items, let's say infrastructure. Now it's a lot of private companies coming to the region with smaller investments. But for me, it's much more relevant now. So you have Didi has always been here and they're growing. Yeah. You have Meituan with Kita. You have the car companies that I mentioned. You have all of these companies. And I think you can see, I think last time the Li Qiang went to the US, apparently he talked to the Chinese companies not to flood the market, right? So I think this is a worry that is going to be beneficial for Latin America as well, because I think the biggest fear we have here is not of a political fear, geopolitical fear. The biggest fear we have is an economic invasion being flooded by the Chinese companies. And I think another aspect that I can see for the future, I think that these companies that are coming from the private sector are actually the companies that are going to make the difference in the next 5 or 10 or 15 years. Because let's say these will be executives that come to Brazil or any other country in the region, and they will probably stay, or they will have kids who will have still business ties with China, which is different from the previous immigration, which was mainly small businesses and people that didn't continue ties with China. So it's changing, and I think that the biggest worry was being too reliant on China, and I think that Brazil and the rest of the region, we will be able to find a good balance.
So yeah, you mentioned this influx of Chinese interests, and mostly now it's private businesses, investors coming from China to Brazil. I think maybe this is a side topic, but it's really interesting. What do you think these investors look for in Brazil, and what do you think that attracts them? Because from what I hear, that in general, many investors are looking at Brazil, even from China. I think you shared me last night, the ETF in China that is investing in Brazil, it has a crazy premium over its assets right now, right? It just shows the kind of popularity of investment in Brazil. Could you just share with our audience, what do you think, why Brazil seems to be in the spotlight right now?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of reasons, and I think they all come together at a good moment. I think that first, we are probably going to a weak dollar cycle. And these cycles are very large, very long, right? From 2001, the peak of the dollar, to 2000, let's say 10, the low of the dollar. It's 9 years. Then from 2010 to 25, let's say 15 years. So these cycles, they tend to reinforce themselves. And the large investors, they are aware of that, right? If you think that the dollar is going to go low or even stop going up, it's already a big assumption to put your money in other markets. When I talk to a lot of Chinese investors, they always ask me about the currency. They don't like that the currency is too volatile. So if you think that the dollar is going to be stable, even if the real doesn't appreciate much, but you can have a decent assumption that it's not going to depreciate much. So this is a big thing. The second point here is, since the tariff war last year, it seems that a lot of investors, they realize that you need let's say, a geopolitical officer. So in the previous years, people talked about the ESG officer. So you have your investment mandate, but you have someone who looks at it and says, that doesn't go according to our policies in this area. Now you most likely will have also a kind of a geopolitical officer say, look, we cannot have our money in this country or that country, this and that. And when you try to diversify, you don't really have a lot of options, right? And especially in emerging markets, Brazil stands out as one of the largest markets. We have a very large capital market, and it's very well organized. We have a huge, amazing infrastructure, capital markets. Our SEC is amazing. We have good banks and brokers and lawyers. It works very well. Our exchange is one of the best in the world, for example. So for investors, even if they don't want to put a lot of money here in Brazil, eventually they have to put some because it's one of the most attractive capital markets. The other point is, it seems that outside the portfolio flows, if you are in terms of FDI, as we mentioned, Brazil is a very large market. We have more than 200 million people, and we have a level of income and a level of sophistication that very often we are sophisticated enough to have the new technologies. It's not that we are a backwards country, but we don't yet have these technologies or these new products. So it's a very good market to deploy new products and services. I see a lot of interest from not only Chinese, but also other Asian countries. I see them coming more and more to Brazil. And I think this will be a long cycle. And I think it's mutually beneficial.
The one topic that you mentioned, which was really surprising to me, was the importance you placed on BYD's entry into Brazil's market. And you also mentioned about other notable companies like Didi and Meituan. From a Chinese perspective, though, last 1 or 2 years, there has been many controversies that seems to coming out of these stories. So last year, I remember there was a labor dispute in BYD's factory in Brazil. And then there was also this over competition between Didi and Meituan in Brazil, which was actually perceived very negatively in China. Is we are like exporting our worst practices to Brazil and we are causing trouble there. And that was like the main narrative in China. So from our perspective, first of all, we were reminded of our massive presence in Brazil. Many people didn't know that. Many people didn't know that BYD had a huge presence in Brazil in the first place until that labor dispute. And many people didn't realize that Didi and Meituan, they were actually competing fiercely in Brazil, right? So first of all, we were reminded. And second, we were reminded of our poor image there. That's how the Chinese look at it. Right. But how do Brazilians look at this? Is this such a big deal? Yeah.
Yeah, the funny thing to start is that in Brazil, Didi is a long time player and Didi is yellow here. So it's funny that one here is yellow as well. So it's both of them are fighting the same sector and with the same color. Look, I think a lot of people here in Brazil, they don't realize that these companies are Chinese. Right. So Didi doesn't use Didi. They bought a car hailing company in the past called 99. It's a taxi company. There's nothing there that for you to think that it's Chinese. Meituan most likely will be the same thing. So all these services companies, I think they have no China attachment, let's say, to their brand. So yeah, so I don't think people realize that much. The manufacturing, yes. Manufacturing is a typical foreign coming to produce. I think that, as you said, the Chinese market and the Chinese practices are very particular. And the Chinese companies, when they come out to other countries, let's say in Brazil, they will realize that the practices are different. And they do realize. You can talk to them and they will say it's too slow. Yes. Bureaucracy in Brazil is much larger than in China. They will say that labor issues are an issue. It's a big issue. The US has been in the global stage for 70 years since the Second World War. And the US makes a lot of mistakes, but they learn from their mistakes. It's a long journey, right? And China is just starting it, right? I have a funny story that I spoke to a friend from one of the competitors of two companies that you mentioned. And he says, yes, the Chinese have to learn a lot about our local market. He said, for example, in Brazil, we have to take into account the delivery person, football team, because we know that when you have a delivery to do and the guy's football team is playing, you will have delays and something will happen. Every market, you have their unique characteristic, right? So yeah, just it's typical of growing abroad.
So let's switch gear to something more serious. How do Latin Americans think of U.S. China? It seems the world is trying to figure out their boundaries. The whole world is trying to figure out how to deal with this situation, the G2. What do people there think about this right now?
Yeah, so I think this is less of a day-to-day discussion here compared to, say, Europe or Southeast Asia, right? Latin America, South America especially, day-to-day is not a subject like the great power politics. But the truth is that China has been doing business in the region for the last 20 years and increasing. We talked about this. And on the other side, the US had forgotten about South America, Latin America. That's more or less the situation. And it's funny that people complained a lot that the US had forgotten the region, and now that the US has a lot of focus on the region, other people are complaining there's too much focus, right? The region it's quite balanced, I would say. And the funny thing is also that in the region now everyone talks about the Monroe Doctrine, but you have to think more actually about the Roosevelt Color Era, right? Which is later. And that's the time that the famous quote that President Roosevelt said, that you speak softly and you carry a big stick, right? So I think that the way that people see here is everyone is looking how far the US will go and how far China will go. So I think it's a moment of observing. So I think what people will see here is you see the political cycles, you see how your peers behave. You don't want to stand out. You want to be more discreet and see how things evolve. Recently, the Singapore Prime Minister said that the old rules of the game have changed, but we have not yet written the new rules. So I think it's a little bit like that. Everyone's kind of a wait and see mode. And another thing that is important to say is that in the past few years, a lot of people talked about China de-risking or even decoupling, right? And they realize how hard it is to move away from Chinese manufacturing. A lot of people now say that they want to de-risk from the US assets and the US capital markets. And people will also realize how hard it is to move away from the US capital markets. So the reality is that most countries in the world, they will have to deal with this problem. You have to rely on the Chinese manufacturing and the US capital markets. So the good news is that almost every country in the world has this problem. So you're not alone. So you just try to be discreet and see if someone else stands out, and you learn from the reaction of the two, US and China.
Yeah, if we talk about great power competition, it's hard to escape the topic of what happened to Maduro just a few weeks ago, right? People, at least here in China, some of us were afraid that after this, and after this very clear show of force from the US in Latin America, a lot of the trading relationships between China and Latin American countries will be impacted, especially since a lot of the strategic commodities like copper, lithium that China need come from Latin America. So some of us were afraid that this would actually, in the end, make it harder for China to trade with countries in Latin America in general. Do you see that as a key risk? Do you see that countries there, they were more afraid to deal with China and to stay in the good graces of the US, or is not actually relevant?
Yeah, I think that, as I mentioned before, I think the issue here is more about not being overly reliant on China and doing things that call too much attention. Because the thing is, what China offers the region is not something that the US is willing to offer, right? Yeah. The US actually has raised tariffs on the region, right? So it's how can we exclude the Chinese and who we're going to sell to, right? So I think that the US wants to make sure that the region is not overly reliant on China. So I think that the impact is probably on the pace rather than the direction, right? You have specific cases, okay? Panama, Central America, Venezuela is a very specific case, as I mentioned. In Cuba, people talk about Cuba, the Chinese relationship with Cuba and Venezuela, it has always been problematic. It's not as people think it is, right? I think it's just a speed limit. I think it's a bit like that. Now, if China wants to buy a big port somewhere, maybe it's going to be more complicated, right? So I think countries will just wait and see. I think one interesting thing is that Latin America is a peaceful region, right? We were actually not prepared to think about the things after the beginning of the year. There's no clear enemy in the region. No one has a nuclear weapon. So it's a reassessment, as I said, right? But it's also unlikely that someone will ask for the Chinese help if they think they're threatened by the US. That's not going to happen, right? The countries here in the region, they have normally a good relationship with the US. That's an aspirational country, right? People look up to America. They share very similar values. It's not exactly the same, of course, but I think people will not cancel the US. It doesn't make sense, I think. It's just a reassessment. I think it's more on the pace. One thing which I think it's an example of will grow actually, for example, is that the US exports a lot of services to the region. Like we spend a lot of money on Netflix, AI, cloud, right? I think China will increase a lot in these sectors. I think because of the price, people will use more maybe Baba Cloud or DeepSeek, whatever. We already do a lot of TikTok. Maybe we will not do large infrastructure projects that call a lot of attention and the president in the US would not like. But year after year, you will probably see that the service balance between Latin America and China will grow. And this will be at the expense of American companies because they are more expensive. So it's just the flow will change. I think this is about it.
Okay. So, Joan, you live in China before and you talk regularly with folks here. What do you think are the biggest misconception of them about Brazil, about Latin America?
The biggest misconception, I think the biggest problem is not a misconception, it's a total lack of understanding. Like it's not for you to have a misconception, you first need to have a conception. I think the biggest problem is a lack of understanding. I think that because we sold only commodities for a long time, there was not a need to really develop relationships. You just put the product on a boat and it reaches China at some point. I think that there are perceptions in China about Latin America that, we're broadly correct. We're a different culture, right? And some things you cannot, maybe we don't like, as we mentioned, bureaucracy, the slow of doing business. But if you look at you in Brazil, you will see that people love the food. They like how happy people are. They like the music, how free people in Brazil feel culturally and socially. So I think there's a lot of a match between the two cultures. And some people come to the region, they work 3-4 years and they come back. And some people really enjoy and they stay. So there's a little bit of everything.
If there's one thing that China or Chinese businesses should do better, which one would that be in Brazil?
I think it's a brand. I think the China brand, because I think that more and more China brand is going to be a positive thing, and I think that China as a country doesn't have a very good PR. Let's say, I think Japan, Korea, they have been doing this for a long time, but they have a very good brand. So I think this is the brand China is the one thing that will probably be bring a big difference in the next few years.
Great. So I think we've talked almost an hour, and this has been a very fruitful discussion. Is there anything more that you want to add here that I didn't talk about?
Yeah. Another interesting point is education. So it seems in the past few years that you have a much larger flow of people from Latin America going to China to study. I know a few people going to Fudan, people going to Zhejiang. I'm sure you will have people going to Beida and other places. If China can offer a place with cheap masters or PhDs, safety, and easier language, I think it's going to be very attractive for Latin Americans. At the same moment as the access to the US is harder. But I think it's a different group. I think that there's no competition between people who want to go to the US with people who would go to China. But I think that this will be a big subject going forward because, as I told you, I live there in China, and I'm surprised that people in Brazil and Latin America, they have very little experience. But maybe in 5, 10 years, there will be 10 or 20 times more people doing that. So I think this will be a game changer.
Perfect. I think that's will go a long way to also help to grow China's perception and the branding that you talk about. Sure. Great. Thank you again for joining us. We will definitely have future episodes together as well as the topics arise. Thank you again.
Thank you, Robert. It was a pleasure, and looking forward to see you in Shanghai this year.
See you.